Hello, class. In this video, I'm going to give a presentation about presentation software, using a presentation software. What that is basically PowerPoint. And so this is a new lecture, given that this is in the middle of sort of the COVID pandemic. When I'm recording this, we've had to transition from in-person critiques to online critiques at the end of the semester, and it's really good to know how to use this stuff. So this is basically a lecture for tips on how to use something like PowerPoint. And we'll talk about the other options as we get into the the lecture as well. So basically, I'm going to break this discussion into two components. The first one will be basic digital presentation strategies, tips, rules of thumb, things like that that'll help you set your presentation apart. That'll be this video. I'll make a probably follow-up video where I'll show a sample presentation where I put all these concepts together so you can see sort of a more holistic presentation uh, about architecture. So um, look at that animation over there on the right. As I said, well, generically, this presentation is about presentation software. I was going to start off by saying PowerPoint, which is one presentation software, is basically taken over the world. It's the one that most people use currently, or ones that often that software is either designed to be like or to be in contrast to. And so it was very popular, even in architecture, is very popular before COVID happened. Of course, now with more virtual presentations happening, it's even more popular than it used to be. Um, Now, PowerPoint and similar kinds of things. So I'll use PowerPoint probably as a generic term, for better or for worse for this presentation. I mean, any presentation software, but PowerPoint is very useful because of that. It's been used, it's easy to show digital presentations on TVs, over the internet, projectors, whatever the case and it's really useful and powerful in that sense. But also, there's some pitfalls that you need to be aware of. So, how to make a good presentation. It's not hard, but it's easy to make mistakes if you don't know what to look out for. So that's what this presentation is about. So let's sort of get into it. Let's learn how to use it. If I learn how to use it, again, it's tips and strategies more than actually how to use the software itself. So generally, a PowerPoint layout comes in these sort of steps. So up at the top, I say title, have one slide there. The brackets with the number, that's about how many slides you should have for each of these sections. So the title slide was like what I had up front. Mine was pretty boring for this presentation. It said presentation software. And a lot of times when you're doing presentations over PowerPoint, your title slide is going to sit there for a period of time while everyone gets situated. You make introductions, and that's true whether you're doing this virtually or even more so if you're doing it live in person for someone, because it's just up on screen for who knows how much time. So it should look nice. You should definitely have your name on it. If you're working for a company, have your company on it, and a title that sort of captures the presentation. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but it is important to have for a PowerPoint presentation. It's sort of like the cover of your book, and people will be looking at it for a while. Now, the next slide you should have should be like an agenda or your table of contents. It can only be one slide. The reality is, for something like a studio project, which you might be immediately focused on right now, you might not even need that. I probably could have put 0 to 1 slides for the agenda, because we have your title, that we know that that's what you're looking at for your studio project. You don't necessarily need to break it into segments for that, but you can if you want. I'm not saying you don't have to either. You might decide that your presentation cleanly breaks down and you want to explain that. But usually for meetings and things like that in the real world, you will say, we're going to do this and then do that, then do that. Look at the drawings, look at options, come to conclusions, for example. Might be what your agenda is for a meeting. And then, again, you don't have to spend much time on that slide at all when you're presenting it, as I did here in this presentation. And then the next slide after that, a few slides, your introductory summary. Set the stage of what the person's going to see, the big picture view, what you're going to talk about, some introductory concepts of how you got to where you're going. Now, this could be one slide or to 3 slides. Keep it short. When I have these parentheses, like 1 to 3 slides here, or in the next one where we have body, we say less than 20. It's not to say you should be at 3 slides. It's usually the fewer slides in PowerPoint, the better, right? So that's quite opposite. Like if you're thinking about making a research paper and your teacher says have it be 10 to 15 pages, in the back of their mind everyone's thinking, oh, 15 pages is better than 10 pages. And that may be true for something like a paper, a research paper. It's not true for PowerPoint. Actually, the fewer slides you can do it in, the better. It's probably the one mistake that almost everyone makes is they just have too many slides quite often. I do it, everyone does it. But so when I'm just saying that because when I say 1 to 3, you know, one is better than three, but it might, but if you need more than one, that is okay too, as long as you're controlling yourself. Of course, then you want to get into the meat of it, of your presentation, and that's on the top right-hand side, and that's the body of your presentation. And I just have less than 20 slides there. It's an approximation. Some PowerPoints presentations will be fewer, some might be longer, but once you get to about 20, you're getting pretty long, so you want to start being careful. The reality is you want to spend a lot of time per slide. It's better to sit like I'm doing here on this slide and just be talking about the slide, and have people listening to me with some support, some graphical support, than just having a lot of slides. Like I could have put a slide in for each one of these categories, but that would have been too much. So try to keep your body relatively short. And then conclusion, sum it all up, give us the big picture idea. Again, 1 to 3 slides as an estimate, one being better than three, but it's okay if you have a couple. And then finally, what always works is the question slash thanks. A lot of times people end with questions, the statement questions with a question mark or with thank you or whatever the case might be. And that's just to let people know that the presentation has ended. What's going to happen is usually that last slide often stays up for a few minutes as people start discussion. Now you might go back and forth at a certain point in time once discussion happens, but that slide's going to sit there for a while and lets people know it's ended. And even outside of PowerPoint presentations, I often find when students get up and make verbal presentations, even live in person, they often don't. You need to say something like thank you. Does anyone have any questions? You have to verbally say those things as well. Otherwise, people don't know you're done with your presentation. It gets awkward. I've been to many presentations and students are like, blah, 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 this is my building, blah, 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 that's my building, and here's my bathrooms. And then you have that awkward silence, and people are like, was that the end of your presentation? And they're like, yes. Like, okay, well, you should say thank you. Do you have any questions? Or it can be very generic, just like that. Just have it prepared in your back of your mind. Say it every time. No one cares, but it's that signal your presentation is done. The same thing is true in PowerPoint. You need that slide, usually that says thank you, in end presentation, especially if you're doing it synchronously with someone or live with someone, either in person or over Zoom. When you're recording it, obviously the recording ends, so maybe it becomes a little less crucial at that point in time. Now, here's the other thing. The big thing that architects, I think, have an advantage for in PowerPoint presentations that not everyone does is use mostly images and speak your words, right? Don't try to write everything out on the PowerPoint slide. So you can see here, I just made up this slide. The little light gray area is supposed to be a slide, a PowerPoint slide, and I just put an image next to it, and I just put it, it says your home, and just 3 bullet points: secluded, comfortable, beautiful. Now I'm not going to go into this. If I were giving this presentation about this house using this slide, I would go into all of those points. But you can see the points are just there to get enough across, but it's mostly image. If you do need to write yourself notes to talk, like some people put too much text on the slide and their excuse is, well, I need to put that there so I know what I'm going to say in the presentation. There are other ways to get there rather than putting on the slide everyone sees. Of course, you could write it in your notebook or note cards or whatever and have it there on paper. But if you don't know this, actually, when you're using many of the presentation software, there you have your slide on the top section, but on the bottom section is a place for notes for yourself, and you can type what you want to say there. And when you present it, if you do use that section, you can put it in presenter mode, and you can actually read. You can see what you wrote notes to yourself would be on your computer screen, but everyone else would see the main slide like we see here. So I tend not to personally use that too much myself. Sometimes I do, depending on the complexity of the conversation. But maybe notes to myself or whatever. And really the bullet points or whatever other information you have on there, hopefully that's enough to get you going, and get you speaking on all the points that you need to say per slide. So mostly images, and speak your words. And people much prefer to just listen that way than read. I do want to talk about sort of slides, some things about slide layout. So be consistent slide to slide. So obviously, I just showed on this slide, it did switch. You can see the title switches there. I literally have the same slide there. I probably should have changed the image a little bit to get the point across. But if I have a big image, say on the right-hand side, and I have bullet point text set in a gray box on the left-hand side, I want to be consistent slide to slide. So it doesn't have to be identical necessarily. So maybe the gray box on this left-hand side, this area here, maybe that changes sides. Maybe it can't always be on the left. Maybe sometimes it's on the right. Maybe sometimes it's on the bottom. But I'm going to use the same color. I'm going to use the same font, right? Things like that. I'm going to use the same title. My title is going to be in the same spot on every slide. Right? And if it's not, there's good reason for it and it relates to it. So be consistent with your fonts, your sizes, your colors, your general layout. You can be flexible because different pictures need different things, different words need different things, but you should be consistent on those main elements as you move through the presentation. So because you have to be consistent and sort of almost design a slide, like designing a slide and design a slide template or the rules you're going to do per slide is a design challenge in itself. Not a hard one, but you do have to think about it. Most presentation software, including PowerPoint, have slide templates for you to pre-download. In PowerPoint, they're called master slides. You have a master slide that sets the background color and allows for different font sizes and styles to change and things like that. When you start a new PowerPoint, over here on the right is basically what you can get to when you start to new, which is all the templates. I mean, I don't know how many there are, hundreds, thousands, I'm not sure. You search a word, all these come up, but we can see some examples I just pulled up here on the right-hand side. And there are a lot, and they're often overpowered. And I think the reason for that is most people aren't architects. Most people aren't skilled in making drawings. Most people don't make drawings as their primary job and for the primary presentation. They've got a lot of words. And these templates are really set up to be the graphic interest for a slide when all you can add yourself is words. Like, so imagine you're I don't know, I'm just making things up, some economist or something. You deal with numbers and you deal with words, but you still need something visually interesting to look at if you're going to make a PowerPoint presentation. So you might go to one of these templates and it's got color and crazy things here and there, and that's going to help graphically perhaps. But that's not what we do. We make drawings mostly. That's how we communicate. So we want as I said before, the drawing to speak, the image to be the main thing. So most of these templates, they compete too much with the architecture you're trying to show. So my first rule of thumb for templates is don't use any of the templates in whatever software you're using. Just design your own. There might be some simple ones you can start from. But don't be afraid of just picking your own title and location, your own color fields, whatever the case might be. You can look at precedents, and that's fine. You can use, but design your own and keep it simple because again, you want your architecture to read, not the PowerPoint slide to overwhelm. So keep your slides simple. And as I say, that last bullet point already, the pre-made slides they tend to be overkill in any software, so I don't recommend using those. And so if I just jump back one slide here to this be consistent, my template here is a title up top that has some bold font, a gray bar on the side that has nicely spaced and large text, pretty simple, and a rectangle, and then an image off to the right. That's my template. Now maybe this image becomes multiple images, maybe this box changes slightly or whatnot, but my template is pretty simple in that regard. Well designed. Let the architecture speak for itself, right? So the other thing people tend to do with PowerPoint presentations, similarly because of visual interest, like again, if you mainly have words and you're not making your own pictures yourself, they'll put all crazy animations and slide transitions into their presentation. Again, to try to capture visual interest. But again, architects, they have an advantage in this area because we make great drawings, hopefully, and that should be your visual interest. So just for clarification purposes, an animation is a change in the image that happens on one slide. And I'll show an example of this here in a second. And a transition is an animation that happens slide to slide. So for that might be like maybe it fades through black or something. That's a common one. But they can get quite crazy in most of they have these things that fly across the screen, twirl around and do somersaults and sparkle and who knows what, all the kinds of crazy things. Again, if that's the only visual interest you have because you don't have good drawings, maybe that works for you. I don't know. It's distracting. But for architecture, you want your your images to read. So you need to be careful when you're using animations and transitions. So I'm not saying don't use them. They are useful sometimes. And when you use them, you want to use them to tell a story, right? So if it goes to incorporating something in your presentation, then it's fine. So for example, here's a project I worked on. This is an image of Philadelphia that I took from a helicopter, and we actually did this as part of the presentation. This is existing conditions, and when I push the button, it just animates slowly, a slow fade into what it will look like, as our proposed design project. Um, so I can do that again. I can go backwards. There's the original image. It's just a slow fade into what it looks like. So that's telling a story. It's like, this is what you have now. This is what it's going to be. We often call these before, like, do a before and after slide, right? And that's again to help tell the story about what we were doing. There, it makes sense. And it's not too flashy. It's not twirling across the screen and jumping around and all some other crazy things. It's subtle, and it goes to being what I need to use for presentation purposes. All right. Now, that's the fade is probably the most subtle animation you can use. I have used at times other ones. So I have, on rare occasion, you can actually set up quite complex animation in PowerPoint if you want to. It takes some practice. I'm not going to go over it in this video, but like if this project's about an existing building somewhere and things need to be moved, like you could set it up so pieces of program move across the screen visually. But it's starting to push the flashiness a little bit in a case like that. But again, if that's like what you're telling in your story, like we need to move this here to here, it could potentially help on rare occasion. But generally, use animations sparingly. Don't use flashy ones, and use them to help advance the story you're telling in your presentation. Now, here's an important slide. I'm sort of being cheeky with this slide a little bit, but it says, let the slide title do a lot of work. So try each slide should have its own title, either on the top or the bottom or wherever. And be very clear in that. Try to capture as much information about what you're going to say in that one line. So again, I don't even need anything else on this slide. I don't even need any content. The title tells everything I need to for this slide. So being sort of silly with this, but yeah, let the slide tell the title of your work. Be thinking about what you're doing. So the other thing, that PowerPoint usually has is bullet points for text. And so let me go over some basic rules, the of thumb for bullet points. On the left-hand side, I have those rules. On the right-hand side, I have an example slide of how they might be used. So minimum font size of 20 point. So one of the things is you can often put too much text on the slide, and you want to keep your text minimum. You want to speak your text. You want to have large images. We went over that. One way to help you do that is to just keep your font size relatively large. So I'm recommending minimum font size 20 point. Do I sometimes break that rule? Yes. You can sometimes break it, but be consistent. It does two things. Not only does it help you keep your text sort of not overwhelming the slide, but also, especially if you're giving a presentation in person and you're just using a TV screen, people need to be able to read the text that you have on there. So if it gets too small, that you just can't read it. Now, that's a little bit less of a concern when you're presenting over Zoom, because everyone's sort of making it big on their own personal monitor, and they might be able to manage the reading that way. But certainly, in person, that is an issue. You don't want to get your font too small. So 20 points, a good recommendation. Maximum bullet points per slide, approximately 4. Certainly fewer is better. One bullet point obviously wouldn't need a bullet point. You could just use text. If you have 5, is it the end of the world? No. But by the time you start getting more than 4, you should start to question, should I have more than one slide for this information in that case, right? I know you want to keep your slide count down, but you also want to go over the bullet points and take your time and not have too much text, save room for space. So there's the point. It's like, okay, you got 4 bullet points, you're good. Another one, maybe you jump slides and add another one. But approximately in that zone, about maximum 4 bullet points. And then maximum lines per bullet point, I'm saying 2, and that can certainly again vary. Have I had more where there's 3? Certainly. And also depends on how much space you're giving for the bullet point. So for example, on the actual slide, this whole slide here, I don't have much room for text. This gray box is relatively small. On my sample slide, I've actually given almost 50% of the slide to bullet points. In either case, there's just 2 lines of text. It makes it easy to read, and has it self-controlled. But again, it's just really just a rule to help to make sure you're not writing too much text on the slide. But saying, I'm going to try to keep it to a maximum lines of 2 lines per slide. All right, so more rules just on general text rules of thumb, just sort of along the same example. Don't read word for word. Be able to just look at it yourself and be able to speak to it. People can read themselves. People usually, when they're reading word for word, they're not as interesting in voice, and it gets a little boring at the same time. So don't read word for word. Just put the text up there and then talk whatever you want to say. But do go over point by point. All right. So one of the things people do is they might throw bullet points up on a PowerPoint slide, and then they either don't go over some of the points, and in which case you're like, well, why did you put that point up there in the first place? It just took up space that you could have been using for something else. Or they might jump around the points a little bit, and you can jump around a little bit. There is some leeway, but also you don't want to be confusing. You don't want to go to point 1, then point 3, then point 2, then point 5, and then do that on every slide. People can't follow along. So as much as possible, when you get into the points, go point by point. It'll just be more clear for everyone, and make sure you hit them. And if you're not going to speak about a point, don't put it up there. All right. And then bullet points are not the only way text can be used. Titles and bullet points. You could use short paragraphs. They can be used sometimes, especially if the slide is not going to be presented verbally like this, or in some cases it's not going to be presented verbally like this. Short paragraphs are okay. I try to avoid them as much as possible, but sometimes it's needed. And I do think there is this contrast here, because sometimes people are like, you know what? I'm never going to present, like, this presentation is not meant to be presented in voice like this. In that case, which does happen sometimes, you are going to have to use more paragraph-like writing, because in that point it becomes more like a report than it does like a PowerPoint presentation. So there is certainly that exception where that might happen. But for this, for this presentation, I'm sort of assuming you're doing the verbal presentation like this, as you will be doing for your work this semester. So basic rule layouts. We've talked about basic rules for presentation boards and other things, and those same rules apply to PowerPoint slides. Like, there's no difference. I'm not going over all the rules that we've discussed in the other presentation. You can go back and do that. But if you need help remembering, they're pretty simple. They're pretty straightforward, but they're good rules nonetheless. So align drawings and fields and crop as needed. Right. So you can see on my example slide, I'm using a different example slide over here. We have this drawing goes from top to bottom. That equals this drawing and this drawing. So it's a nice little square of 3 images here. And even this code, I'm not going to get into what this code meant. It was important for the presentation. It dealt with sustainability issues and which ones we were hitting on the slide. But again, this is aligned in the sort of same space that the rest of this is aligned in. So align your drawings and crop as needed. So I don't remember now. I did this presentation a long time ago, this particular slide, but this might have had more sky. It might have had more grass. I don't remember, but I cropped it so that it could be the same height as these images, right? So that's okay. And that's even in your own work. Like if it's a perspective or whatever, you might crop some of it out to make an alignment. Obviously, if it's a plan, you're going to have your whole floor plan in, or whatever the case might be. But if there's some site context that gets a little trimmed off so you can have nice alignment of images and pictures, that's perfectly fine. Of course, be consistent with your margin and drawing spacing. So again, if we look at this slide, like this space and this space and this space, they're all equally sized. The top has more room just because of the title and whatnot. So be consistent. You don't have to measure it out. Just visually be consistent. Of course, sometimes there's balance issues with drawing, so you might be slightly different sizes in those areas for one reason or another, but you want to be consistent, make sure it looks good, well organized. That says a lot. It meant you took the time to make a nice presentation. And then, just like I recommend in presentation boards, things want to be on a grid, but prioritize columns over rows because that's how people read. And so again, here we've got a column of this basic information that was important for this presentation that dealt with sustainability, sort of the column of wind turbines, and then a column of some secondary energy sources on that side. And sort of continuing with these points, just flipping slides here. Don't put too many images on one slide. So when I can, I usually try to stick to one because especially on a PowerPoint slide, there's limited space. But sometimes you need more than one image on the slide, or it's perfectly fine to have more than one image on the slide, like on this one. So even when you do that, sometimes some images might be larger than others. So that's as we can see on here, use large images. Multiple ones are okay. But when you're using multiple ones, also don't be afraid of making some more important than others if that's needed to tell your story. So for example, in this slide, I have the big wind turbines because this is much more of a viable clean energy source at this point in time than these other ones. These other ones are a little more future looking, so they take a secondary role. They're smaller and they're less clear. So that's using hierarchy. Is perfectly fine if you are going to use multiple images. Sometimes the images are equal weight, and that's also fine. You might have 3 images and they're all equally important, and they might need to be equally sized in that case. But don't be afraid of making some bigger than others if you need to. And lastly, the most important rule, that's the rule of many of the presentations this semester, is tell a story in your presentation. Everything should go toward telling your big ideas. And so I actually pulled the slide on the right. That's a template that I found that says tell a story using PowerPoint. Just to be silly, but have a beginning, middle, and end, just like you would have in a story, like in a storybook or a report. Have a clear conclusion, and making sure all your work before the conclusion slide builds up to that conclusion. That's the most important piece. And be bold. Like, don't hold back. Don't be afraid to tell your story. There's so many times I see students making presentations, when they talk about their architecture, and they talk about it intellectually, they talk about it correctly, but they get into the weeds. They're just talking about their floor plans and how they put this thing here and that thing there and have this stair over here. That's all well and good, but always go back to why you did it. Like, I was trying to create this experience for the user. If I'm trying to think about the projects you're working on right now, they tend to be sort of residential scale. It's like I wanted to make a livable home that had a connection to the environment, for example. So whenever you talk about it, be talking about how you have that connection through the door. The door allows you to go outside and make the connection. Right? That's the story you're telling. Not that you have a door, that your door allows you to go outside. It's big and glass and you can see. That's just one example. You're going to obviously have to come up with your own reasons for, and every project's going to be differently, but don't be afraid to talk about those big ideas every chance you get. Not just sort of the cold hard facts about your architecture and what you did. This is practice. This is why we make you guys present all the time, so you can keep making that work and keep getting better at it. So those are your sort of tips for PowerPoint presentations, but I do a couple more slides in this presentation that I want to go over. And the first one here is about presentation software types. So PowerPoint's only one kind. Again, it's the most popular kind right now. You have PowerPoint, but the one that I'm using currently, and I often use a lot, is actually Google Slides. It's free, comes with Google Drive. I like it because I have the cloud storage, and I know PowerPoint has that now too, but I sort of got into Google early, and I've got lots of Google stuff personally. And I like it because I like it because it keeps my stuff separate. Like, I can present this, I can get Google Slides from wherever I'm at. My slides are my content. I've made them, I've written them, they're copywritten to me, and so I don't have to get confused with using, say, my company's software. In this case, SUNY Delhi, their PowerPoint software. If I put it on their computer, it could become less clear, perhaps. So I like it. It's my full control. I can take it wherever I want. That said, if I'm working in it, when I have worked in companies, if the company is using PowerPoint, like for an architecture firm, and I'm making content for them and they own the copyrights and all that, I will obviously use their software in that case, which usually most always happens to be PowerPoint. They work very similarly to each other. So you can use one, you can use the other. Then you have Keynote, which is basically just Apple's version of PowerPoint. And so if your company is using that, or you have an Apple or whatever, it's perfectly fine to use that as well. And then we got some extra ones here. So down in the bottom middle, we have InDesign. InDesign is also a good choice to use to make presentations. You wouldn't give the presentation in InDesign. You would only design it in InDesign. And what you would do is you would make a PDF and then present the PDF, because PDFs can be presented very similarly to the way PowerPoints can, with a viewing mode and all of that. Now, InDesign, as you can see, is made by Adobe. So it's made by the same company that makes Photoshop and makes Illustrator. Um, and because of that, it's really good on graphics. Now, we don't go over in the class that I'm designing this presentation for, we don't go over InDesign uh, as a part of this class, because we're going over so many other new software. We save that for another class in portfolio. But it's very similar to Illustrator, has a lot of the same controls, except for where Illustrator is designed for making new content sort of on a single page. InDesign is designed to make a sequence of pages. So it could be like something like a book or a magazine, or a PowerPoint presentation, or a slide presentation where each slide is unique. It's really great for setting up templates and creating your own templates for the type of people who are graphic. It's really great for linking images together. So it does things better than PowerPoint or Google Slides might do. So it has those advantages. I didn't talk a lot about it here because I didn't want to introduce a new software, but you're free to use it. And actually, what I found professionally, whereas some people do use InDesign for this way, a lot of times in say even an architecture firm, it's not used, and the reason for that is like your boss or whoever might need to access the PowerPoint presentation and make edits to it themselves. They might not be that good in InDesign. They might not have that graphic experience. At least when I was going through, that might change over time as more people learn it. But because there had to be sort of this flexibility that other people need to get in the presentation, the preference is usually just go to PowerPoint. Everyone can use it, will be good, even though you might have some advantages in InDesign. Those advantages are lost if other people have to do it. So, but it is a good choice, especially if you're just working on your own and you know the software and you really want to get into the graphics of it. Of course, the last one I just want to talk about briefly is Prezi, which is over there on the right. It's a popular one. It's actually done differently. You don't actually make slides or pages like you do in the rest of the software. It's sort of, I don't have a lot of experience with it. It's sort of more of animated quality. It's this big plane and you zoom into things. And the idea, as we're going to see on a next slide or two, one of the disadvantages of PowerPoint in the similar cases are they tend to be very linear. People don't necessarily think linearly all the time, though, and so Prezi allows you to sort of jump back and forth and whatnot. But I found it, like, a lot of people complain that it makes you sick because it's almost like being on a roller coaster ride. It can be it's super easy to over animate it, although it is sort of a different take on the presentation software that can be fun to use. But you do have to be careful about it, like anything else. So that's what this slide is about. Linear versus holistic. And by this slide, what I mean is comparing a drawing that you might, or a bunch of drawings that you might print out and hang up on the wall and speak to versus speaking in PowerPoint. So I've got on the bottom right hand side a presentation board that has a perspective. It's got an elevation, it's got the floor plans all printed out. And if I were giving this in person, I'd print it out, I'd pin it up on the wall, and I'd speak to it. And yes, I might start by speaking about the floor plans, or I might start by speaking about the elevation or the perspective or whatever. And my words are going to have to be linear. But as I'm speaking, everyone who's paying attention, they can look at whatever drawing they want to. So I could be talking about the perspective and talking about maybe how you enter or how the porch exists. But if someone wanted to, they can also take a look at the floor plan and being at the same time internalizing that information, floor plan and in elevation simultaneously, because they can see it all up there all at once. But you can't do that in PowerPoint. PowerPoint is limiting. Again, you're only going to have one image on a slide, or maybe just two or three other images that are in support of it. And as you go through, someone's going to have to remember, oh, now they're showing me the perspective. I have to think back to what the floor plan looked like, right? And that's not as easy. It's not as convenient, but it is the way it is. It's probably the biggest downside of presentation software digitally like this. So you have to present linearly. You can only show the images linearly. It's very difficult to give a holistic view of the presentation. So there are a few ways to help mitigate this that people use. So one thing, page numbers help because people can remember page numbers, or they can go back and say, "Oh yeah, that's on page 3. Go back to that page." Or slide might be a better word. Slide number, doesn't matter. I don't often use them, but I do use page numbers sometimes because it can help communication and thinking through things. What is often even better, again, if you're presenting in person to someone, is you might present over PowerPoint, and that's good, but don't be afraid to print out 8.5 by 11s or 11 by 17s uh, of your entire presentation. Some people do it with just the little slides. Like they might get like 3 slides per page or 6 slides per page, and you can set that up when you're printing from PowerPoint. But I also say don't be afraid of just doing 1 slide per page. And just making it big. They can graphically look at it. And what it does is allows them, if you're on the perspective, but they want to remember what the floor plan looks like, the viewer can turn to the slide that's the floor plan and clearly see it, and then make that connection, like making a whole presentation like we have up here on screen, right? So it's the closest, by having 1 slide per page, although it might seem like a waste of paper, it's the closest you can get to making a holistic presentation, I think, in PowerPoint. Of course, you can only print and send if you're speaking live. If it's still this sort of COVID pandemic and you're over Zoom, that's not an option for you. But someday hopefully this will be over and you can go ahead and do that. And ultimately, as I've said, there's really no substitute for pinning drawings up on the wall, but it is what it is. In fact, you could do that, and I have done, where presentation, there's lots of drawings pinned up on the wall, even though the presentation is also given over PowerPoint. So you can go through slide by slide, but again, anyone could tilt their head to the wall and see the holistic presentation. So just be careful. Like, it's hard. I know the fact that PowerPoint is linear, but you have to try to deal with it as best you can. So that is the end of this presentation. So as I say here, go out and make great presentations. Use these tips, rules of thumb, as you go. And what I'll do is I'll follow this up with probably another video just on a demonstration presentation. And so I look forward to seeing you in class. Thanks for watching.